The smell of roasting chilies had no business being on a space station. That was the official position of the Galactic Food Standards Council, and they had 17 regulations to prove it. Danny Reeves did not care about their regulations. He cared about the fact that his cumin seeds were about to burn. So he pulled the small pan off the portable burner and gave it a shake. The seeds popped and released a warm, earthy cloud that drifted straight into the ventilation system of Station Arrivo. He had arrived 2 days ago as Earth's food trade representative. The title sounded important. The reality was less glamorous. He was a cook from Las Cruces, New Mexico, chosen mostly because he was willing to fly 6 months through deep space and because he owned a passport. The Earth Trade Bureau had given him a small cargo container of samples, a formal suit he had not yet worn, and a speech written by someone who had clearly never eaten a taco in their life. Station Arrivo was the largest trade hub in the known galaxy. Hundreds of species passed through its corridors every day, buying and selling everything from raw minerals to synthetic atmospheres. Food, however, was treated as an afterthought. Most species had moved past the idea of flavor centuries ago. The Palori, who ran the station, consumed tasteless nutrient paste from silver pouches. The Drumi, a busy insectoid species who handled most of the station's maintenance, ate compressed protein blocks that looked like gray chalk. The Heska, amphibious diplomats with wide dark eyes and smooth green skin, absorbed mineral broth directly through their pores. Nobody cooked. Nobody seasoned. Nobody gathered around a table and argued about whether the salsa needed more lime. Danny found this deeply sad. His first official meeting with the council had gone badly. The chamber was a wide, cold room with curved seating that rose in tiers around a central platform. Danny stood at the bottom, looking up at 43 delegates from species he could barely pronounce, and presented Earth's application to export spices and prepared foods to the galactic market. The response was laughter. Not all species laughed the same way. The Palori made a sharp clicking sound. The Drumi buzzed their wings. The Heska inflated small pouches on their necks that made a sound like a wet balloon. But the meaning was universal. Sorith, the senior Palori delegate, had been the most erect. He was tall, silver-skinned, and carried himself like a man who had never been surprised by anything in his life. He looked at Danny's application, then at Danny, and said that capsaicin was classified as a Category 3 chemical irritant. It sat on the same restricted list as Drumi venom extract and Heska nerve tonic. Human food, Sorith explained with the patience of someone talking to a child, was a biohazard. Danny had tried to argue. He explained that billions of humans consumed capsaicin daily, that it caused no tissue damage, that it was, in fact, the foundation of some of the greatest cuisines ever created on Earth. Sorith asked if humans also enjoyed other forms of self-harm. The chamber clicked and buzzed again. The application was denied in 4 minutes. Danny walked back to the small human quarters on Deck 9 and sat on the edge of his bunk for a long time. The room was gray. The walls were smooth and featureless. The air tasted like nothing, which was apparently how the galaxy preferred it. He thought about his grandmother. She had run a taco stand on a dirt road outside Las Cruces for 31 years. The stand had no sign. It did not need one. People found it by smell. She cooked over open flame, used chili she grew herself, and made tortillas by hand every morning before sunrise. She fed ranch workers, truck drivers, lost tourists, and once a governor who pulled over because the smell reached the highway. She always said the same thing. Food is not food if it does not make you feel something. Danny opened his cargo container. Inside, packed carefully in vacuum-sealed bags, were dried ancho chilies, guajillo chilies, whole cumin, coriander seeds, dried oregano, smoked paprika, garlic, onions, limes, canned tomatoes, masa flour, and 3 bottles of hot sauce he had made himself before leaving Earth. There was also 10 kilos of frozen beef, wrapped and labeled in his own handwriting that he set up his portable burner on the small desk. He pulled out his cutting board, his grandmother's cast iron pan, and a wooden spoon that was older than he was. If the galaxy did not want human food, the galaxy had simply never been given a proper introduction that he began to cook. The cumin went in first, then the garlic, then the dried chilies, torn by hand, and dropped into a hot pan where they hissed and curled and sent their smoke up into the station's air system. Somewhere on Deck 7, a HFY security officer stopped walking. Her wide dark eyes blinked twice. She tilted her head and inhaled. Her species could detect chemical compounds at concentrations that most sensors would miss. Something was moving through the ventilation system. Something she had never encountered in 14 years of service that IT was not dangerous. She was almost certain of that. But it was, without question, the most interesting thing she had ever smelled. Gulan had followed worse smells to worse places. 14 years in station security had taken her through chemical leaks, waste system failures, and one memorable incident involving a droomy pheromone accident that cleared an entire trade deck for 2 days. She had trained herself to identify over 6,000 airborne compounds by scent alone. This was not any of them. She moved through the corridor on Deck 8 with her head slightly raised, nostrils open, reading the air the way her species had done for thousands of years before they ever left their homeworld. The compound trail was layered. There was something sharp and warm at the front, followed by something deep and smoky, then a bright note she could not name that sat underneath everything else like a foundation. She reached Deck 9 and stopped outside the human quarters. The door was open. Inside, a human male stood over a small cooking surface, stirring something in a dark metal pan. The room was thick with warm air and the source of every compound she had been tracking. Danny looked up and saw a HFY officer standing in his doorway. She was about his height, green-skinned, with large dark eyes that were blinking rapidly. "Are you all right?" he asked. "What is this?" Gulan said. Her voice was steady, but her neck pouches had inflated slightly, which in HFY body language meant she was either alarmed or fascinated. She was not sure which one applied. Danny explained that he was cooking. Gulan asked what cooking meant. Danny paused because he had not expected that question, and then explained that cooking was the process of applying heat and seasoning to raw ingredients in order to make them taste good. Gulan asked what taste good meant. Danny realized this was going to take a while, thought he invited her in. She hesitated, ran a quick scan with her handheld sensor, confirmed that nothing in the room was toxic at current concentrations, and stepped inside. She sat on the edge of the bunk and watched Danny work, that he talked while he cooked. He told her about the chilies, how they grew in hot, dry soil under harsh sun, how the plants produced capsaicin as a defense against being eaten by mammals, and how humans had looked at that defense mechanism and decided it was delicious. He told her about cumin, which had traveled along Earth's trade routes for thousands of years. About garlic, which appeared in almost every cuisine on the planet because it made everything better. Gulan listened. Her species valued information, and this human was providing a great deal of it. But more than the words, it was the smell that held her attention. Every few minutes, Danny would add something new to the pan, and the chemical profile of the room would shift. It was like watching someone paint, except the canvas was the air itself. Then Danny made salsa. He diced tomatoes, onions, and a small green herb he called cilantro. He squeezed lime juice over the top and mixed it with his hands. He sliced open a small green pepper, jalapeno he called it, and added just a few pieces that he offered her a small spoonful. Gulan looked at it. It was red and green and wet. Her sensors told her the capsaicin concentration was low, well within safe limits for her species. She extended one finger and touched the surface of the salsa. Her skin absorbed a trace amount instantly. Her entire body flushed violet. The sensation was extraordinary. Her species absorbed nutrients through their skin, but their diet consisted of mineral broth, simple, clean, and utterly without complexity. This was different. This was dozens of compounds arriving at once, each one distinct, each one doing something different to her receptors. The acid of the lime, the sharpness of the onion, the green brightness of the cilantro, and underneath all of it, a gentle, warm pulse of heat from the jalapeno that spread across her palm and up her arm like sunlight. She sat very still for 30 seconds. Danny watched her with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I need more," Gulan said as sound came from the doorway. They both turned. A droomy maintenance worker was standing in the corridor, antennae fully extended and vibrating. His name was Cheekit, and he had been repairing a ventilation panel 2 decks up when the smell hit him. Drumi communicated partly through pheromones. Their antennae were finely tuned chemical receivers, and the cloud of compounds pouring out of Danny's kitchen had reached Cheekit like a shout across a quiet room. He had followed it down 2 flights of stairs and through a service corridor without even thinking about where he was going. He stood in the doorway, clicking softly, and pointed at the pan. "What is that?" he asked. Danny smiled. "Dinner," he said. "You want some?" Cheekit entered the room and sat on the floor beside Gulan. Danny went back to work. He still had tortillas to make, beef to braise, and onions to pickle. The 2 aliens watched him in silence, their senses overwhelmed by a small room full of ancient Earth flavors. None of them noticed the blinking yellow light on the environmental panel by the door. The station's central monitoring system had detected an atmospheric anomaly on Deck 9. It was not yet classified as dangerous, but the readings were unusual enough that an automated report had been filed. Somewhere in the station's security center, a screen updated. A small flag appeared next to the human quarters. Danny pressed a ball of masa flat between his palms and laid it on the hot iron. It sizzled. Gullen's skin shifted to a deeper shade of violet. Cheekit's antennae trembled. The tortilla was not even done yet, and the galaxy was already beginning to change. The tortilla was warm. That was the first thing Cheekit noticed. Not room temperature, not the neutral state of every food he had ever consumed, but actively warm. It sat in his forelimbs like a small, soft sun. Danny had spent the last hour building something he called a proper spread. The beef had been braising in a sauce of ancho and guajillo chilies, low and slow, until it fell apart at the touch of a fork. He had charred corn directly over the burner flame until the kernels blistered and popped. He had sliced red onions paper thin and soaked them in lime juice and salt until they turned a bright, shocking pink. 3 salsas sat in small bowls, a green one made from roasted tomatillos, a red one built on dried chilies and garlic, and a bright orange one that Danny set slightly apart from the others. "That one," he said, pointing to the orange bowl, "is the serious one. Habanero and mango. Start with the green." Gulan and Cheekit sat on the floor of the small human quarters, watching Danny assemble the tacos with the focus of scientists observing an experiment. He laid a tortilla flat, spooned the shredded beef into the center, added charred corn, a few pickled onions, a drizzle of green salsa, and a squeeze of fresh lime. He handed the first one to Gulan. She held it the way Danny showed her, tilted slightly to keep the filling from spilling. She pressed her palm flat against the underside of the tortilla and let her skin do what it did naturally. The effect was immediate. Her receptors flooded with information. The fat from the beef carried deep, smoky compound from the dried chilies. The corn had a sweetness that was sharpened by the char. The pickled onions cut through the richness with acid and crunch. The salsa verde added brightness, green and sharp and alive, and all of it was held together by the tortilla, which was not just a wrapper, but a flavor of its own. Warm masa, slightly toasted, with a grain and earthiness that grounded everything else. That Gullen's skin cycled through 3 shades of violet before settling on a deep, rich purple that Danny had not seen before. Her dark eyes were wide and unblinking. "This," she said quietly, "is the most complex chemical event I have ever experienced." Danny grinned. "Wait until you try the habanero." He made one for Cheekit next. The Drumi held the taco in both forelimbs, antennae shaking. His species ate by breaking food into small pieces and processing it through mandibles that could detect basic chemical profiles. But Drumi food had no profile worth detecting. Protein blocks were uniform, predictable, safe. This was none of those things. Cheekit took a bite. His antennae went rigid. His wings buzzed once hard, and then stopped. He sat perfectly still, mandibles working slowly, processing flavors that his biology had never been asked to interpret. The capsaicin from a salsa triggered a mild heat response. The fat from the beef coated his mouth. The lime juice made something spark at the back of his palate that he had no word for it. He set the taco down very carefully. He looked at Danny. Then he looked at Gulan. Then he looked at the taco again. "This," Cheekit said in halting universal standard, is the most important object I have ever held. Danny laughed. It was a good laugh, warm and easy, and it filled the small room. He told them to eat, and he started making more. While they ate, Danny talked. Not about food science or chemical compounds, but about his grandmother. Her name was Rosa. She had come to Las Cruces from a small town in Chihuahua with nothing but a cast iron pan and a recipe for red chili sauce that she kept in her head. She built a taco stand from scrap wood and fed people for 3 decades. She never wrote anything down because she believed food was something you learned with your hands, not your eyes. She taught Danny to cook when he was 8. She put him on a wooden crate so he could reach the counter, and it showed him how to feel when the masa was right. Not too wet, not too dry. She taught him that the secret to good salsa was patience. You had to let the flavors talk to each other before you served it. Danny told Gulan and Cheekit that his grandmother fed anyone who was hungry. She never asked for money first. She believed that a meal shared freely was worth more than a meal sold. She said that when you cook for someone, you're telling them that they matter enough to spend your time and your fire on. Gulan listened without moving. Cheekit's antennae drooped low, which in Drumi body language meant deep, emotional engagement. Danny assembled more tacos. He worked steadily, hands moving with the easy rhythm of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Tortilla, beef, corn, onion, salsa lime. Each one the same, and each one slightly different, because that was the nature of handmade things. Then the environmental alarm sounded that IT was not loud. A soft, pulsing tone that came from the panel by the door. The yellow light that had been blinking quietly for the past hour had turned red. The station's central monitoring array had upgraded its assessment. The atmospheric anomaly on Deck 9 was no longer a footnote, that IT was now classified as an unidentified chemical event requiring immediate investigation. Danny looked at the alarm, then at the 3 bowls of salsa, then at his 2 guests who were both reaching for another taco. Well, he said, this should be interesting. 3 Palori officers came through the door in full hazmat gear. Their sealed suits were white, their visors tinted, and they carried scanning equipment that hummed and beeped with urgent purpose. They looked like they were expecting to find a chemical weapon. Instead, they found a man in a stained apron dicing onions next to a Heska officer and a Drumi worker who were both eating what appeared to be folded bread filled with meat. Subcommander Nessic led the team. He was Palori through and through, tall, silver-skinned, expression locked in a permanent state of disciplined disapproval. He stopped 3 steps inside the room and swept his scanner across the air. The readings spiked immediately. Capsaicin, Nessic announced. Concentration at 0.7 parts per million. That exceeds safe thresholds for 11 registered species on this station. Danny wiped his hands on his apron. It is food, he said. Nessic looked at the pan, the bowls, the tortillas, and the 2 aliens sitting on the floor eating their 4th taco each. His visor display was showing him a chemical breakdown of the room's atmosphere, and the compound list was long enough to fill a full incident report. Garlic compounds, sulfur derivatives from the onions, volatile oils from the chilies, Maillard reaction products from the seared beef, acetic acid from the pickled onions. It looked like the aftermath of a small industrial accident. Officer Gulan, Nessic said, turning to the Heska. Why are you here? Gulan looked up from her taco. Her skin was still a deep violet. Research, she said without hesitation. Nessic was not convinced. He ordered his team to catalog every item in the room. They scanned the cargo container, the spice bags, the salsa bowls, and the cast iron pan. One officer held a scanner over the habanero mango salsa, and the device made a sound it had never made before, a rapid high-pitched chirp that indicated compound concentrations beyond its default range. This substance, the officer said, pointing at the orange salsa, is registering higher than Drumi venom extract. Danny nodded. That is the habanero. It is spicy. Nessic removed his visor and stared at Danny with bare silver eyes. You are telling me that your species consumes this voluntarily. With great enthusiasm, Danny said he explained it the way he had explained it to the council, but simpler this time, because Nessic did not seem like a man who enjoyed long speeches. Capsaicin triggered pain receptors. This was true. but it caused no actual damage to tissue. The human brain, upon detecting the false pain signal, released chemicals called endorphins. Endorphins produced a feeling of happiness and well-being. "We eat the fire," Danny said, "and our brains reward us with joy." Nessic blinked once, twice. He looked at the habanero salsa. He looked at Danny. He looked at Golan, who was now reaching for taco number 5. "This is against at least 9 station codes," Nessic said. "Probably," Danny agreed. There was a long silence. Nessic's team stood behind him, scanners still running. Cheekit chewed quietly in the corner. Golan watched with wide, dark eyes. Then Nessic did something that his service record would never fully explain. He removed the gauntlet from his right hand and extended one bare silver finger toward the bowl of habanero mango salsa. "Sub-Commander," one of his officers said in a warning tone. Nessic ignored him. He touched the surface of the salsa. A single drop clung to the tip of his finger. He looked at it for a moment, then placed it on his tongue. The Palori had taste receptors roughly 4 times more sensitive than humans. Their species had abandoned flavor millennia ago precisely because their sensitivity made most natural compounds overwhelming. They had retreated into bland nutrient paste as a form of sensory self-defense. Nobody had ever told a Palori that overwhelming could feel good. Nessic dropped to one knee. His silver skin flushed deep blue from his jaw to his temples. His eyes went wide and unfocused. His remaining gloved hand gripped the edge of the desk. His team rushed forward, reaching for him, but he threw up his bare hand and waved them back that he stayed on the floor for a full minute. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the soft hiss of the burner and Chicket's quiet chewing. When Nessic stood, his skin was still flushed blue. His eyes were clear. He looked at Danny with an expression that Danny recognized because he had seen it before, on the face of every person who had ever tasted his grandmother's cooking for the first time. "Again," Nessic said. Danny made him a taco. Then he made one for each of the hazmat officers who had removed their gloves by this point and were no longer pretending this was an investigation. WY evening. Word had spread through the station in the way that all important news travels. Not through official channels, but through whispers, curiosity, and the unstoppable drift of really good smells through a ventilation system. 12 species were now represented in Danny's small room, being sat on the floor, on the bunk, in the corridor outside. Danny worked the burner without stopping, pressing tortillas, spooning beef, squeezing limes. His tortilla supply was running dangerously low. His salsa bowls were nearly empty, and the environmental sensors on Deck 9 had given up trying to classify what was happening and had simply flagged the entire section as anomalous. Danny did not care. He was feeding people. That was all his grandmother had ever done, and it had been enough to change a small corner of the world. He suspected it might be enough to change a small corner of the galaxy, too. Soreth had not slept. This was unusual for a senior Palori delegate, whose entire philosophy of life was built on order, routine, and the strict regulation of unnecessary sensation. But 17 formal complaints had arrived on his desk before sunrise. 9 purchase requests for human spice products had been filed with the trade office. For separate petitions demanded the reclassification of capsaicin from a restricted compound to a recreational substance. And then there was the matter of the Drumi maintenance worker who had, according to official station records, performed a legally binding bonding ritual with a taco. Soreth read that report 3 times. Drumi bonding rituals were serious. They were triggered by deep neurochemical responses and, once performed, were recognized under galactic law as permanent emotional commitments. Cheekit had apparently held the taco against his thorax, released a bonding pheromone, and declared his attachment in front of witnesses that it was, by every legal standard, irreversible. Soreth called an emergency session of the Galactic Food Standards Council. The chamber was full. Word had spread far beyond the usual delegates. Observers from species that rarely attended council meetings had filled the upper tiers. Golan sat in the gallery, her skin still carrying a faint violet tint from the night before. Cheekit sat beside her, clicking softly, with what appeared to be a small wrapped tortilla held carefully in his forelimbs. Danny was summoned to the central platform. He walked in still wearing his apron. There was a smear of salsa verde on his left sleeve. He looked tired but calm, the way a man looks when he has been cooking for 12 hours straight and has nothing left to prove. Sorith addressed him from the highest tier. Human representative. You were denied trade authorization by this council. You then proceeded to distribute an unregulated chemical substance to members of multiple species, triggering a station-wide environmental alert and at least one irreversible bonding event. How do you answer? Danny looked up at Sorith. He looked around the chamber at the dozens of faces, silver, green, brown, iridescent, scaled, smooth, all watching him. He took a breath. I made tacos, he said, that a murmur moved through the chamber. Sorith raised a hand for silence. Danny continued. He spoke quietly, without the formal language of diplomacy or the careful phrasing of trade law. He spoke the way his grandmother had spoken, plain, direct, and from somewhere deep that he told them about Earth. He said it was not a gentle place. The ground shook and split open. The sky threw lightning and ice. The oceans rose and swallowed cities. The air carried disease, dust, and fire. Humans lived on a world that was constantly trying to kill them, and they had done so for hundreds of thousands of years. And somewhere in all of that chaos, Danny said, someone figured out that if you put seeds in hot oil, they tasted better. Someone discovered that meat held over fire changed in a way that made people want to gather close. Someone crushed a dried pepper between two stones and realized that the burn on their tongue made them feel alive. That was what spice was. Not a chemical irritant, not a biohazard. It was proof that humans could find beauty in the middle of disaster. That even on a planet that shook and burned and flooded, people chose to make things taste good. Not because they needed to, but because they wanted to. Because making food that brought pleasure was an act of defiance against a universe that offered none. He told them about the pepper traders who crossed oceans in wooden boats to bring spice to strangers on the other side of the world. About grandmothers who kept recipes alive through wars and displacement, carrying their culture in their hands when everything else was taken. About how a single meal, shared freely between people who had never met, could do something that 1,000 treaties and trade agreements could not. Food is not fuel, Danny said. Not for us. Food is how we say I see you. Food is how we say you matter. Food is how we turn strangers into family. The chamber was silent. Sorith sat motionless in his high seat. Gulan had turned fully violet again. Cheekit held his taco closer. Danny looked around the room one more time. You can keep capsaicin on your restricted list, he said. You can classify my grandmother's salsa as a weapon. But you should know that on Earth, we have a saying. The best meals are the ones you did not expect. And you did not expect this. Sorith called a recess. During the break, Danny stood in the corridor outside the chamber. 9 delegates approached him, one after another, from 9 different species. They all asked the same thing. Could he cook for them, privately, quietly, away from the official record? Danny said no. He said he would not cook in secret. He would not treat his food like something to be ashamed of. But he would cook for everyone, openly, together, if they gave humans the right to share their food without restriction. The delegates looked at each other. Some of them had never shared a meal with another species. Some of them had never shared a meal at all. They went back into the chamber. Sorith called the vote. The vote was not unanimous. The Palori delegation formally abstained, which was their way of saying they agreed, but were not yet ready to admit it in writing. 2 minor species with no sense of taste voted against out of confusion. But the rest, 37 delegations representing over 100 worlds, voted yes. Human spices and prepared foods were reclassified. Capsaicin was removed from the restricted compounds list and placed into a brand new category that Danny was asked to help name. He thought about it for a while, standing in the chamber with salsa still on his apron, and then said, experiential nutrients. The council accepted it without debate, mostly because nobody had a better suggestion and also because several delegates were already thinking about lunch. The news spread across Station Arrivo within hours. Within days, it reached the broader galactic network. Within a standard month, Earth received more trade inquiries about food exports than it had received about anything in its entire history of interstellar contact. human futures became a real financial instrument. A Hesker investor group tried to buy exclusive rights to cilantro and was politely turned down. Danny did not go home. He had no reason to. Everything he needed was on station arrivo. A burner, a pan, fresh ingredients shipped from Earth on the newly established spice route, and a growing number of beings who showed up at his door every evening asking what was for dinner. He opened a taco stand on the station's main trade deck. It was small, just a counter, a grill, and a few stools. He built it himself from salvaged station panels and a piece of wood he had shipped from Las Cruces. Behind the counter, he hung a framed photograph of his grandmother Rosa, standing in front of her own taco stand on that dirt road in New Mexico, smiling the way she always smiled, like she knew something the rest of the world had not figured out yet. He named the stand Abuelas. It became the most visited location on station arrivo within 3 months. More popular than the trade exchange. More popular than the diplomatic quarter. More popular than the observation deck with its view of twin nebulae. Beings came from across the station and eventually from across the sector to stand in a line that sometimes stretched across 2 full decks and wait for a taco made by hand from a human who remembered their name and asked how their day was going. Gulan resigned from station security. She said she had spent 14 years cataloging dangerous compounds and had never found anything as complex or as beautiful as a roasted guajillo chili. She partnered with Danny to develop what she called a flavor safety index, a set of guidelines tailored to each species, mapping which human foods were safe, which required gradual introduction, and which should only be attempted by experienced eaters. The habanero mango salsa required a 3-stage tolerance program for pylori. It had a waiting list. Cheekit became the galaxy's first droomy food critic. He published his reviews in a pheromone-encoded journal that became wildly popular among species with chemical-based communication. His review of Danny's barbacoa taco, slow-cooked beef cheek with pickled cabbage and smoked chipotle salsa, was later described as the most emotionally moving piece of food writing ever produced in any medium. He still carried his original bonded taco, now carefully preserved in a sealed display case that he wore around his neck. Nessick never officially acknowledged what happened in Danny's quarters that night. His service record listed the event as a routine environmental response with no actionable findings. But station supply logs showed that he purchased cumin, dried ancho chilies, and smoked paprika from Danny's cargo stores, and maintenance records indicated that a small, unauthorized cooking surface had been installed in the subcommander's private quarters. Nobody mentioned it. Everybody knew the deepest change was not about food. It was about what food made possible. Species that had spent centuries eating alone in silence began gathering in groups. Shared meals became a form of diplomacy that no formal treaty could match. Arguments between trade delegations were resolved over bowls of Danny's pozole. A long-standing territorial dispute between 2 insectoid species was settled during a 7-course dinner that ended with churros and chocolate sauce. The phrase "breaking bread" entered universal standard as a loan phrase from Earth English. No one translated it because no other language had a term that meant exactly the same thing. It meant more than eating together. It meant choosing to sit across from someone and share something that took time and care to make. It meant saying, without words, that this moment matters, and so do you. Danny was interviewed once by Galactic News Network. The reporter, a young pylori woman with silver skin and curious eyes, asked him how a single taco had managed to overload an entire space station's environmental sensor array. Danny leaned against his counter and thought about it. He looked at the photograph of Rosa behind him. He looked at the line of beings stretching down the corridor, pylori, drumi, heska, and a dozen other species he now knew by name. People keep underestimating flavor, he said. But flavor is just love you can taste. And love does not care about your sensor thresholds. The reporter thanked him and turned off her recorder. Then she asked, quietly, if she could try one that Danny handed her taco. She took a bite. Her silver skin flushed the faintest blue. Outside, the line grew longer. A small pylori child tugged on their parent's sleeve and pointed at the stand. The parent looked at the menu, looked at the line, and hesitated. Then they smiled. They joined the line. Everybody always did.